Alright guys, BLM here, back with a new video, and in this video, I'm here to talk about the sequel to one of my favorite games from the last generation, and that game is A Plague Tale: Requiem, which feels like a game that took the initial premise of A Plague Tale and made it much grander in every possible way. The gameplay improved to be more than your typical stealth-based game. The narrative taken from a pretty small-scaled, character-focused story into this more massive, expansive journey that puts this game at a scale that I really was not expecting it to be. And with that comes some pros and cons, and I will say, as a whole, I loved A Plague Tale: Requiem. I think this is easily one of my favorite games of the year. However, that doesn't mean I think it's flawless. I do think there are certain pacing issues that I find throughout the game. I think there are certain plot issues I have with the game. Also, the gameplay is still not perfect. I definitely have a lot of issues that we will talk about, but at the end of the day, I still really adored what this game did, expanding upon A Plague Tale Innocence, so much to the point where I really did not expect it to be as grand of an adventure as it ended up being. Now, like Innocence, it is still a mostly stealth-based action-adventure game, a mostly linear game in that. Though in this game, the areas are much more expansive. There are a lot more options in how you approach each encounter, and through that definitely adds a lot of variety in how you play the game. But again, the emphasis on stealth, while it is still there in this game, it is definitely decreased, where Amicia isn't one hit killed by most enemies anymore. She can usually take three hits from enemies and does have recoverable health. And again, there are still a bevy of sections that are just straight up combat sections, where they just throw a number of enemies at you and you just have to kill them all. And I will say, again, I find those sections really annoying. I still feel like, while yes, the combat is improved in this game, it's still not to the point where combat is actually good or fun. It still feels very slow. It still feels like stealth is the main way to approach this game. But when the game forces you to kill a bevy of enemies, many of which are just a pain to kill, it definitely does add a level of tedium to those sections for me. Now, they changed up the weapon system in this game, and for the most part, I think it's for the better, where in the original game, you could use rocks and pots, and then beyond that, you could also use a wide range of alchemy-based items that can light or extinguish fires, or affect how you interact with the rats. However, this game changes up a bit to where these different types of alchemy-based items are now turned into different types of ammunition, which kind of changes how you approach combat here, where now any rock or any bow or any pot can be infused with these different types of items, giving you a larger range of how to use these items. I also think another change that was for the better is the fact that you don't need to actually pick up rocks anymore, which was something that was definitely annoying in the original game, I felt. And in this game, you're just given an unlimited number of rocks to use. Also, the upgrade system has been a lot more streamlined, where in the original game, there were wide ranges of items that you would need to get a certain amount of in order to craft. Here it's just condensed to just pieces that are around and you pick them up, and it allows you to upgrade things. And to be honest, a lot of this streamlining, I could very much see an influence from The Last of Us. And this game even includes knives, which essentially act as shivs. Again, the pieces system feels like the parts system. Again, it feels like they're adding in things like Molotovs. It really just feels very Last of Us-y to me, which I do think is better because it's at least more streamlined that way. But obviously in this game, with Hugo by your side for a lot of it, you are also able to utilize the rats a lot more than the original game, where that was an ability that wasn't unlocked until the very end of last game. But in this one, you're able to actually control the rats, and to be fair, it's very limited. I never really felt that incentivized to use this system that much, though it is definitely an interesting change to the gameplay style here. Now beyond that, obviously rat puzzles return, and it's mostly the same stuff, just minor improvements. Obviously, through the new weapons in the game, you can have some new varieties and how to approach these sections. Also, through new companions. Each companion pretty much has their own skill that you can utilize to help navigate through these areas. And again, I think this game does a good job at introducing new things throughout the game, sparsely, to where the puzzles never really feel old. And again, from a pure gameplay perspective, I do feel like this is an improvement upon the first game in pretty much every conceivable way. However, something to note here is that the game is locked at 30 frames on consoles and is also just straight up pretty poorly optimized. There's many points where it seems like the camera is stuttering. Obviously, frame rate issues are constant. Pop-in is constant. Like, there are a number of technical issues that I've come across the PS5 version of the game. And mixing that in with, again, only 30 frames on console, that is definitely a knock against the game. Though, like, to be fair, I do understand it, considering at the end of the day, this is a game developed by a AA studio, and considering how grand of a game this is, how straight up beautiful a lot of sections of this game are from a graphical standpoint, how insane the amount of rats that are on screen at that point. Again, it makes sense why they decided to try to optimize that part of the game more so than making sure the game can run at 60. But with that, I mean, I feel like that's most of the gameplay things to talk about. Again, at the end of the day, it's mostly just the same but better. But now let's run through the game, talking about the narrative, which I am still conflicted on. I do think as a whole, narratively, this game has some of the best character writing I have seen in recent years. I adored the characters of Amicia and Hugo across this game. I really liked a lot of the side characters that you come across this game. And to be honest, I feel like the dynamic between Amicia and Hugo and how much I really love that dynamic and how it concluded kind of clouded my mind while I was actually playing the game, to where it wasn't until immediately after finishing the game that I kind of thought about it and was like, wait, a lot of this doesn't necessarily make sense. Or at least I shouldn't say make sense, but more so like it's not explained. And again, mixing that in with like certain pacing issues I definitely have issues with the narrative here, but I do feel like the brilliant character writing kind of overshadowed that, to where I still really enjoyed this game despite those flaws. But yeah, let's start off running through the game. Chapter 1 involves us obviously getting a tutorial to the basic systems of the game, and in many ways this did very much remind me of the first chapter of the original game, and a bit of downtime where we're spending time with Hugo and Lucas as we're playing games in the middle of an empty field. And it very much feels like the calm before the storm that we obviously see moving on in the chapter, where we eventually get attacked by this group of villagers and again get introduced to more of the stealth aspects of the game. But this section concludes with Hugo ending up killing our attackers using his rats. That obviously feels like a reminder of the grim nature of this world here. But this is followed by a dream sequence where we play as Hugo, where we see him on this island, where it feels like this dream is guiding him to this island, which becomes the inciting incident of this story, with most of the story revolving around going to this island and figuring out the secrets within it. Well, following this, we do end up riding in a carriage with Hugo and Amicia's mom and Lucas, kind of just continuing off the ending of the previous game until we get attacked due to Hugo having killed those two previous villagers. And this leads to this pretty decent set piece of us trying to escape through this burning field, though either way we end up escaping with the group still intact, which I will say kind of makes this prologue section feel kind of pointless from a narrative perspective. Though either way, in chapter 2 we do arrive in Province in order to find a member of the order named Magister Volden, to which we could think he can help Hugo. And really, chapter 2, the beginning of it, ends up being this really massive piece of downtime of us just exploring this village and having these pretty great interactions with Hugo that really remind you of the bond that these two characters have at this point. Though eventually we go off with Lucas in order to find Volden, in which we get a pretty lengthy section where again the game continues to teach you things about its core mechanics, and it's a pretty expansive section of enemy encounters at first, but then after that we get introduced to the rats, and along with that obviously comes a decent amount of rat puzzles. And chapter 2 ends when we find Volden and get him to help Hugo, though he does come off as a very standoffish character, one that is clearly not well intentioned, and Hugo seems to get worse under his care, kind of playing into the themes of the story moving forward. Then we get to chapter 3, which does involve us going out to find supplies from a local alchemist, to which we get another bevy of sections involving enemy encounters, though eventually we do find the alchemist's location, only to find everything gone, and we have our first major enemy encounter here, which again is really annoying. I really don't like these sections where they just continuously spawn enemies at you, and it really was not fun to play, though it does show how far Amicia will go in order to save her brother, once again being a major theme of this story. But we do eventually end up getting captured by this very generic villain named the Beast, and the rest of the chapter revolves around our escape. Chapter 4 has us returning to Volden, where we do learn that Hugo's disease is terminal, and he tells Amicia to accept her brother's fate. I will say again, like, this feels like a theme of the narrative here, is how Amicia does whatever she can to try to save her brother, but no matter how hard she tries, it ends up being futile. All she is doing is delaying the inevitable, which is really sour theme of the story is something that I think is to be commended to a degree, though something I do find strange about the game is that I don't feel like it really commits this theme until the very end of it, though at the same time that could fit into the theme. This aspect that they continuously try to give you hope to thinking that this game's themes are something other than the futility of Amicia's struggles, and thinking that there's hope in saving Hugo when in reality they tell you from very early on that there isn't. Which to that I do think comes some wonky writing moving forward, where you focus a lot of this story around these themes that don't end up really mattering. But either way, chapter 4 has us clearing the path at the harbor in order for us to leave by boat for Marseille. And again, this is a pretty extensive sequence as well. Numerous enemy encounters, numerous rat-based puzzles, but it does conclude with a really massive set piece. A set piece that really shows you the scale of this game, where it is insane when you get to this point, seeing this city being destroyed by rats, seeing entire buildings crumble, and you having to escape in a very Uncharted-like section where this swarm of rats are following you and you're running through the streets across rooftops in order to escape it, and it really is insane. Which again, I think is a massive pro in the sense that yes, the scale of this game is much larger, and it reflects both in the gameplay, in the level design, and also in the narrative. However, I do feel like there's something missed as well, where I do think some of the charm of A Plague Tale Innocence was how simple and how focused it was. Though again, it's definitely something to be applauded here with Requiem and how a AA studio made a game in this massive of a scale. But the section ends with us sorrowfully walking through the streets of Providence, now with the entire city completely destroyed, really setting an even more somber tone of the narrative. Now, chapter 5 has the group riding down a river, to which Amicia now wants to escape from the Order alongside Hugo in order to follow Hugo's dreams of this island, though this is against the wishes of her mother, and eventually the boat ends up getting stuck, to which Amicia and Lucas end up having to get it unstuck, and along the way they obviously have numerous conversations about this, until the chapter ends with Amicia deciding to run off with Hugo, though again along the way this is also where we get the crossbow and more combat sections that are not that fun to play. But this is where we get the chapter 6, where Amicia and Hugo are on their own, now searching for a way to reach the island, to which following this we get this really massive stealth section of this massive quarry we have to navigate across that's filled with enemies, and again this allows us to utilize numerous tricks to our advantage, but eventually this is also where we get to control the rats for the very first time. Eventually this all leads up to a boss battle against the beast, to where I did struggle here the first few times, though finally I accidentally beat him on my final attempt, to where I chipped away his armor as he was already standing in a massive fire, which has led to him dying instantly, which I found kind of funny. But this leads to a pretty big escape sequence immediately afterwards, to where Amicia passes out due to her injuries, to which we are rescued by Arnaud, one of the soldiers that were chasing us back in chapter 5, and decides to help us. And Arnaud ends up being one of the more major side characters in the game, and I did end up really liking his character by the end of it, him being this father-esque figure for Hugo, to where despite Amicia's hesitancies with him, Hugo instantly bonds with him, and while we do learn that he later has some more sinister motivations, I did overall end up liking his arc across this game. But also I really liked his additions to the gameplay, where he is a companion that can literally just fight enemies and kill them, even armored enemies, which made him a very useful companion. Though really you only use him across chapter 7, though chapter 7 does mostly comprise of your adventures with Arnaud, as you again have a lot of combat encounters and rat puzzles, because again that's the game. But eventually we do meet up with an acquaintance of his in Sophia, who has a boat that will take us to the island of Hugo's dreams, in that being Lacuna. And Sophia here is a pretty major character across this game, but to me was surprisingly so, where initially again she just comes off as like the captain of the ship that we end up riding on, though from chapter 9 to 11, this 3 chapter stretch that are 3 of the longest chapters in the game, she becomes your main companion companion during those, and ends up also being the only new ally in this game that ends up surviving till the end, which makes her play a major role in the story, though I will say I also was kind of perplexed by why. I mean, again, Sophia is fine, she's a likable figure here, but one that I never fully understood why exactly she was still going with Alicia and Hugo and why she cared enough to go with them, considering we never really see them bonding too much until she's already dedicated to them. So I did find that to be kind of a strange aspect of this game. But of course, after recruiting Sophia to our cause, we still need to do more combat and rat puzzles in order to get to the boat, to which we eventually set sail, giving us a bit of downtime as we can talk to the characters aboard the boat, which I did find to be a pretty nice moment. Though really, it doesn't really last that long as we end up arriving in Lacuna just a few minutes into Chapter 8, which I will say, I was surprised that we got there that soon. I was assuming that most of the game would be this journey to Lacuna, which would resolve in the last couple chapters, but instead we get there in Chapter 8 out of 17, not even halfway through the game, and really a bulk of the game ends up taking place there. But our immediate arrival at Lacuna ends up being very similar to our arrival in Province from Chapter 2, in this being a very lively city, a really beautiful city graphically, and one where we obviously have a festival going on, because that's always the thing that happens in this game, and we once again have this downtime with Hugo as we're exploring the city, though eventually things go awry when we end up encountering the Count of the city's leader, which is where we get the reveal that Arnaud has not been as good as he seems, where it turns out that he has actually wanted to recruit Hugo here in order to use his abilities to kill the Count, as he wants revenge on him. And we do again get this escape sequence as we have the guards chasing us, and we end up having to stealth our way past the bird that would rip our faces off, so that's a section in this game. But eventually we do end up encountering the Count and the Countess, to where the Countess takes a liking to Hugo almost instantly, and instead of killing us as you would expect them to, they instead take us in, while obviously still arresting Arnaud. And right away, I did feel like the Count and Countess were very clearly going to be antagonists here. They just came off as sketchy right from the beginning, and while, again, they seem nice off the bat, it was pretty clear that was all a ruse. But Chapter 9 ends up starting the following morning, where we set off to go and find more about the macula, to which we end up encountering Sophia once again, who ends up joining our party here for some reason. And again, I don't feel like they ever properly explain why she cares enough to, but she's there. And Chapter 9 ends up being a very explorable chapter here, where while the main narrative does take us to trying to reach a shrine in the mountains, you can also just explore the outside of the city, to where there's this like windmill puzzle. If you solve it, you end up getting a bracer that, to be honest, I felt like had very little significance, though I believe it's supposed to allow Amicia to get up a bit quicker from enemy attacks, though again, not that great, but it's a little side activity there. But again, more enemy encounters and rat puzzles along the way, up until the point where we get to the shrine, which is where we learn that the Count and Countess are essentially leaders of this cult that worships the child of Embers, who they clearly assumed to be Hugo. But we end up dressing up to join their ritual, to which by doing so we end up learning about the previous carrier of the Prima Macula, in that being Brasilius, who also conveniently had a protector in Elia, making it clear that these two obviously mirror the characters of Amicia and Hugo here. But this is also where we start figuring out that Elia has left tracks behind to try to point our characters in the right direction, which ends up comprising of the next couple chapters. Though I will say, I'm still a bit confused over what exactly this was for. I mean, it really does feel like padding for most of it. I didn't feel like any of this was absolutely necessary. While conceptually, yes, I mean, like Elia leaving clues behind is interesting here, I don't feel like the narrative actually needed it, as at the end of the day, the information that we get from Elia's tracks could have easily been solved in a like 1 minute scene instead of a like 3-hour stretch of gameplay. But again, this leads to Chapter 10, where we continue to follow Elia's tracks alongside Sophia, to which this is where we end up encountering a slave trader named Milo, who conveniently controls the shrine that the tracks lead to, leading to a massive series of combat sections that, again, got super tedious. I feel like this is the point in the game for me that I felt like this was just really dragging on. I didn't feel like any of this was absolutely necessary for either the game or the narrative. Again, the original game was a pretty tight 8 to 10 hours, while this game expands to closer to 15 hours. And I didn't feel like a lot of that was necessary. And I feel like this section of the game is a major reason why. But again, we end up breaking into his fort, going to the shrine, to which it ends up telling us that everything's back at the ruins that we explored back in Chapter 9, which makes this all even more pointless. But this is also where we get another really big combat section, where it's really one of the most annoying combat sections in the entire game. Where again, it's just a swarm of enemies coming towards you, many of which you can't kill easily, and it just ends up being really annoying. But either way, it brings us to Chapter 11, where we have to do some rat puzzles in order to get to the ruins. But once we get there, we do get more puzzles, but after those puzzles, we get revelations about the story, where it turns out that Aelia had failed to save Basilius, and we arrive at the bottom of the tomb to find Basilius's decayed body, revealing that without Aelia there to manage his emotions, as she had been imprisoned by the Order, Basilius ends up going berserk and is the one that unleashed the Justinian Plague around 800 years before the events of this game's story. And Basilius himself had been locked down here in a failed attempt in order to contain the macula, which they obviously end up failing. But this is also where Amicia realizes the entire point of the dreams, where these dreams that Hugo has been having, again, was assumed that it was going to lead us to a cure for the prima macula, when in reality, it is instead the macula showing him these dreams in order to lure him in, tricking the main characters, and allowing the macula to take further control of Hugo, which I am still like kind of conflicted on some of this, where again, like I just really wish they explained the macula more, where I do feel like most of the plot of this game is fundamentally fine. I think the problem is that they never fully explain why, or the macula just feels like this very magical aspect of the story in a story that tried to stay relatively grounded, where it felt like everything within the original game, at least, felt explained within the course of the game's lore. However, I feel like that hasn't really translated into A Plague Tale Requiem, where there's many points where you just have to kind of just like assume that that's how certain things work. And again, at this point in the game is essentially telling you that there is no true cure to the macula. The reason why Basilius and Aelia failed is because they were separated and there wasn't someone to protect the carrier, which makes you think at this point that the game's themes are about family and love, and that these are the things that are going to cure Hugo, all for that to not really end up being the case. As we do get to Chapter 12, where we are called back to the castle by the Count and Countess, to where it turns out that Hugo and Amicia's mother and Lucas have found them, to which we get a short reunion with them. And it's at this point where, again, it feels like the conflict is over. It feels like we found the way to conclude the story. I mean, the chapter itself is even called The Life We Deserve, making you think that the characters have figured everything out, and that is until Amicia is called away by the Count, to where the Count then attempts to kill her, revealing that him and the Countess have known all along that Hugo was the successor to the Child of Embers, and through that, they need to kill Amicia at this point in order to keep Hugo to themselves, which I will say, this entire section of the story is just kind of weird to me, because essentially through this, the Count admits that he knows this isn't real, that he knows that this is just this misguided fantasy that he has created, and the Child of Embers isn't this true god in the way that they look at him. And despite that, he is still so resolute in doing all this anyway. And again, it's explaining the fact that his wife believes all this, and he's doing it for her, but I still feel like this was just kind of ridiculous. Now, I should also say that this is probably one of the more annoying sections in the entire game for me. This section where you have to sneakily escape from the Count as he's hunting you down. And there's one part where you have to open up this gate, though whenever you try to open it, the Count ends up finding your location. Again, I just found that section so annoying. Well, obviously this ends up being a massive disaster to where Amicia and Hugo's mother is eventually killed, and Amicia is beaten, to where Hugo ends up walking up on this, ends up going berserk, unleashing the macula once again, and killing the Countess using his rats. Though through this we're obviously able to escape, but obviously the Count is going to come after us, as he clearly would want revenge at this point, though I will also say it's kind of dumb that he couldn't kill the Count in this position, considering the Count was literally right there. And if he had, then the rest of the story would have been mute, as everything would have been resolved, but whatever. Either way, this does bring us to Chapter 13. 14, which is really the start of the end of the game, where at this point, Hugo is starting to be consumed by the prima macula to where he can barely speak, and we end up having this pretty lengthy section of navigating through the destroyed ruins of Lacuna, which is now overrun by rats. And this probably leads to some of the more difficult enemy encounters in the game, with this essentially being the final non-set piece based set of enemy encounters, where this all leads up to our escape from Lacuna. But before doing so, we end up finding Arnaud, who is about to be executed, and we end up saving him there, which again is another really annoying combat encounter. Probably the one that I personally had the most difficulty with in the game, with there being a massive range of enemies that have heavy armor on, and through that just became really annoying to kill. But eventually we do rescue Arnaud and end up escaping from the city on Sophia's ship, leading us to chapter 14, which ends up starting with another piece of downtime on the boat where you can talk to the other characters, during which we have Lucas talk about how Amicia is now his family, which really feels like it doesn't matter that much moving forward, which I find really weird considering you think it would, considering the themes of the story. But also this is our really final conversation with Hugo, at least in person here, as immediately following this, the ship ends up being attacked by the Count, obviously. Which I would say, I did find this kind of be dumb too, that at this point the Count, again, has a clear reason to be coming for them. He obviously wants to attack them for revenge. However, the way the character talks is as if he's doing this because he truly believes in the Child of Embers, despite the fact that he admitted to us earlier that he knew that this entire story was fake. So I really felt like his character motivations here was just weirdly explained, but either way, we do try to fight back, though eventually Hugo is obviously kidnapped, and Amicia passes out, leading to chapter 15. Where we end up regrouping with Arnaud and Lucas and Sophia, only to then once again get attacked by the Count, which essentially acts as a final boss battle for this game, which is kind of weird considering there's still like another hour of the game following this, but we essentially have to fight the Count's guards as the Count and Arnaud fight separately until Arnaud ends up sacrificing himself to give us an opportunity to shoot the Count in the head, killing him for good, while also giving Arnaud this really satisfying sacrifice scene here that, I will say, does come off as pretty generic. Though I will say it's a pretty satisfying way to see Arnaud die here and conclude his arc. But really, despite this conflict with the Count concluding, Hugo has already been taken, and with him having assumed that Amicia died while getting kidnapped on the boat, he has now allowed the macula to fully consume him, which leads to this section of us riding in a carriage as a massive horde of rats are following us that ends up being this really grand set piece, which takes us to chapter 16, the final true chapter in the game, which ends up putting us in this very dire situation, as again, Hugo has now been consumed by the macula, and from afar, we see this massive conglomerate of rats surrounding this, rat egg, I guess, that supposedly Hugo is in. And again, this is where I feel like the game really takes it a bit too far. This is where it's how? How is any of this happening? This is where I really wish they just explained the macula a bit better, as this does feel really ridiculous that the rats were able to get this much control and all of a sudden doing these really magical things that don't really make sense plot-wise. But either way, it does lead us to a really grand conclusion here as Amicia, Sophia, and Lucas try to get to the center, where Sophia gets injured along the way, leading to us and Lucas going through the final, true gameplay section here. We have to hide behind buildings as waves of rats come rushing towards us, and us having to run towards the center in between each wave. And again, it's a great set piece, though again, also something that comes off as extremely overdramatic. But eventually we do reach the center to where we get this weird dream sequence, and through this, Amicia ends up coming to terms with how futile the situation is, to where we end this dream sequence by putting out a fire instead of continuing the fight, and feeling in line with Amicia's character of her doing everything she can to save Hugo, only for her to now realize that there's nothing she can do anymore. And we end up having this final interaction with Hugo, again telling us in this dream sequence essentially that she knows what she has to do, and well, obviously this is all just leading up to her having to sacrifice Hugo, finding the real Hugo, and end up using our sling to shoot him in the head, only for us to cut to black and we get to credits, which I will say, really insane moment. Like, really great moment there. The fact that the game literally goes from gameplay of you shooting Hugo in the head, this really tense moment, this really emotional moment, where, again, this is why I'm saying where I think the character writing of this game is incredible. You feel so connected to Amicia and Hugo, where in this moment where you are having to put down Hugo, despite how ridiculous the entire plot of all this is and how unexplained all of it is, the feelings that you have for these characters is what really conveys this overall theme of despair as you're having to put down Amicia's brother, who you spent the entire game trying to save. And I do feel like that is something that really, really works here. But again, like, plot-wise, it's a bit ridiculous. Like, none of this is explained and how this is actually happening. But again, I'm able to forego that just because of how great the character writing is here. Something else I love about all this is that this story is essentially a chosen one story. It is one where the story of Brasilius and Elia are supposed to mirror Hugo and Amicia. However, with this further knowledge, you would assume that this would mean that, okay, Amicia is going to get out of this. She's going to be able to save Hugo. But for all this to not happen, and for Amicia to still end up in the same situation that Elia went through, despite having this further knowledge, I think one furthers this theme of how futile this situation was, adding to this overall grim and depressing tone that this entire game exudes, but also, again, is a shakeup to this chosen one story, showing the main character fail in their overall goal, despite being set up to be the person that was going to overcome all the odds. And that is definitely something I do respect from how the narrative is told here, even though, again, I wish they did further explain certain things. But again, this is an extremely emotional moment. I feel like the death of Hugo here, and realizing that there was just nothing that you could do to save him, despite how much Amicia tried. And while it did feel like there was this out, again, this glimmer of hope in the fact that the game shoves in these themes of how love will conquer all, and only for that to end up amounting to nothing as well, I do really like how the game kind of tricks you into thinking that there is going to be a happy outcome for Amicia and Hugo, despite the fact that there isn't. And it's funny too, because I came into this game knowing that was going to happen. I came in knowing that one of Amicia or Hugo were going to die by the end. However, I feel like I was tricked by the game to where, as we neared the conclusion of the game, I was thinking, okay, maybe there's a way they can both get out of this. However, again, through that, I do think the themes of family and love do become a bit muddled. So again, I do like how they use those to trick you into thinking that those were the themes, but I do think it leads to certain sequences in the game feeling a bit out of place now with the context that those themes don't really matter. But either way, with that, we get to chapter 17, the final chapter in the game, which essentially acts as an epilogue similar to how the original game dealt with it. And here we conclude by seeing Amicia having fixed up the home that her and her family were going to stay at, only for Sophia to arrive, where we get the reveal that Amicia is now going to go on a journey in order to leave clues behind like Elia did for the next carrier and protector, which this is also a thing that I don't fully get. Where again, I was under the assumption that the Prima Macula was from your bloodline, to which we even have a chapter in this game called Bloodlines. However, this kind of implies that it's not, and it's more random, or at least not genetic, and I feel like that's something that felt weird to me. Also, it's like, how is she gonna know where it's gonna be and how to leave clues? And also, it's again, Elia's clues themselves didn't really matter that much, so it feels kind of pointless that she's doing this too. And I feel like all this was just kind of weird. I didn't like how this was an aspect of the story here, but either way, also here we learn that Lucas has gone off to master his alchemy and is studying again. It's like, well, what happened to them being family? But either way, the game concludes by Amicia deciding to take one final trip to Hugo's grave right before she leaves for her journey, to which we obviously have this very sad farewell for Hugo. Again, feeling really emotional. I mean, I really do feel like the death of Hugo here is something that I personally really resonated with. I mean, it is like just really depressing to see this young kid who really did nothing wrong and spent his entire life sheltered due to his sickness from the macula, and to see that all conclude in him having to die at a really young age here, and his sister still grieving over his death is such a depressing way to end this story. And when we have also Misa saying the line that when like she sees birds near his gravesite that I always knew you'd be good at making friends. It's such a depressing line. I really did feel emotional with this outcome. Like, while again, the plot points are ridiculous along the way, lore doesn't make sense. I mean, the entire emotional weight of this story and what you feel for these characters is really what makes this game, to where I was left very satisfied by the end, despite all these like minor issues I had along the way. And I guess I should briefly mention that there is also a post-credit scene showing a kid infected with the macula in the modern day, which again, I know some people have said that, okay, this probably means that there's a sequel, where I don't feel like that's the case. I feel like this is more so just showing that this disease is continuing, more so than them setting up any future installment. I do not expect a Plague Tale to continue after this. I know they have already said themselves that they're moving on from Plague Tale. I really don't think we're going to get a third game, and if we do, obviously be with different characters, but even then, I don't think we need it. I think I'm good. I don't know what story there really is to tell within this world at this point. It would just feel unnecessary to me. But there we go. I mean, those are my thoughts on A Plague Tale Requiem. I mean, to me, still one of the best games of the entire year. While it is a game that, again, is flawed in its storytelling, I do still feel like it is one of the most emotional journeys I've gone through with the game, and one that pretty much expands upon the original game in every conceivable way. But I do think with that, again, like, I do feel like the original game felt more focused, it felt more streamlined, where I don't have a major gripe with the original game. Toward this game, again, I do. And I feel like that makes it a bit tough to really reconcile which one I think is better, to where I think most of this game is better than the original game, but it is those bigger knocks that kind of make it a bit wonky. But again, in most ways, this is an improvement upon the original game. Really emotional story here, one I would be satisfied if this is the conclusion to the series. But there we go. I mean, that's my review of Plague Tale Requiem. Now moving forward, I will be doing a similar thing for God of War Ragnarok, which is coming out in a few weeks, so stay tuned for that. Obviously, I have other video game videos as well, but for now, that's the video. Thank you for watching.